They found the wolf cub 3 days after the massacre. I found him, I should say, because no one else was looking. Everyone else was burying their dead or staring at the ash where their homes had been, or simply sitting in the frozen mud of that January morning in 1943 with the particular emptiness that comes after violence has taken everything and left you standing in the middle of nothing. I was the one moving. I was the one walking the tree line at the edge of our convent grounds because I could not be still and I could not pray, and I could not do the one thing that every instinct in my body was screaming at me to do, which was weep. So I walked. And in the hollow beneath the roots of a fallen oak, half buried in snow, trembling so violently I could see the movement from 3 meters away, was a wolf cub no older than 6 weeks. His mother was dead perhaps 20 meters further into the trees, caught in the crossfire of the German patrol that had moved through our village 2 nights before. He was alone. He was freezing. He was the smallest living thing I had ever seen that was still fighting to remain alive. I picked him up and I pressed him against my chest beneath my habit, and I carried him back to the convent. And in doing that single, unremarkable act, I set in motion something that I would not understand completely for another 2 years. My name is Sister Benedykta Malewska, and I had been at the convent of the Holy Annunciation in the village of Sokolniki for 22 years when the war arrived and dismantled everything I believed about the world and about myself. I had entered religious life at 26, older than most of the other sisters, because I had spent my earlier years working in my father's veterinary practice in Lublin, and I could not easily surrender the living world of animals and soil and seasons for the interior life of prayer. But eventually the interior life called loudly enough that I answered, and I brought with me into the convent a knowledge of animals and their bodies that proved useful in ways I never anticipated. I tended the convent's small flock of chickens. I kept 2 goats. I treated the village dogs and cats when their owners could not afford a proper veterinarian. The sisters found this mildly eccentric. The villagers found it invaluable. And God, I have come to believe, found it necessary. I named the wolf cub Kazimierz after the patron saint of Poland because it seemed appropriate that something so small and so stubbornly alive in the middle of so much death should carry the name of a protector. I kept him in the convent root cellar for the first 2 weeks, feeding him from a cloth soaked in warm goat's milk every 3 hours through the night. I did not sleep more than 90 minutes at a stretch during those 2 weeks. My hands smelled permanently of animal and milk. My knees ached from crouching on the stone floor beside the wooden box I had lined with an old wool blanket where Kazimierz slept between feedings. Sister Rosalia, our prioress, came down to the cellar on the 3rd day and stood in the doorway, looking at me with an expression I could not immediately read. Then she said, "Sister Benedykta, you understand that animal will grow into something very large." I told her I understood. She stood there another moment and then she said, "Make sure he knows his name," and she went back upstairs. That was the only permission I ever received, and it was enough. What people do not understand about raising a wild animal is that it is not domestication. You are not turning the wildness into something else. You are entering into a relationship with the wildness, and if you do it honestly, if you bring no pretense and no fear to it, the animal learns to trust you while remaining entirely itself. Kazimierz was never a pet. He was never tame in the way a dog is tame. But he knew me in a way that went beneath language and beneath training. Something older than either of those things. Something that lived in the register of scent and breath and the particular quality of stillness that passes between two creatures who have decided to trust each other completely. By the time he was 4 months old, he was following me through the convent garden. By 6 months, he was sleeping outside my cell door. By the time he reached his first year, he was enormous, gray-silver with pale gold eyes, and the German soldiers who occasionally passed through Sokolniki gave the convent grounds a noticeably wider berth than they had before. The winter of 1943 into 1944 was the worst period of the occupation for our region. The Germans were retreating from the Eastern Front, and retreating armies are the most dangerous kind because they have stopped caring about the future and started caring only about the present moment of their own survival and their own rage. They burned villages for warmth and for punishment, and sometimes, I think simply because the burning gave them something to watch that was not the advancing Soviet forces behind them. Sokolniki was small enough to be overlooked most of the time, but small did not mean safe. We had learned that in January 1943. We had buried 17 people in the frozen ground that January, and the memory of it lived in every face in the village like a scar that had healed badly. I had, by this point, become something more than the convent's animal keeper in the eyes of the village. People came to me for things that had nothing to do with sick goats or injured dogs. They came because I was still there, still moving, still present in a way that felt to them like evidence that presence was possible, that the world had not entirely collapsed into chaos. A woman named Helena Drozd came to me in November 1943 and told me that her husband, who had been working with the local resistance, had hidden a cache of weapons and documents in the forest 2 kilometers north of the village, and that he had been taken by the Germans 3 weeks earlier, and she did not know if he was alive, and she did not know if the Germans knew about the cache, and she did not know what to do. I told her I would think about it. I went back to my cell that night and I sat with Kazimierz, whose head by then rested easily in my lap, and I stroked his ears and I thought about what a 48-year-old nun in an occupied Polish village could possibly do that would matter. By morning, I had my answer. For the next 8 months, I used Kazimierz in ways I am not sure I can fully justify and am not sure I need to. The forest north of Sokolniki was territory he knew as well as I knew the convent corridors. I had walked it with him for a year, and he had mapped it in the way wolves map territory, completely, precisely, with a knowledge of every variation in scent and sound and ground cover that no human intelligence service could replicate. When I needed to move things through the forest, documents, messages, occasionally a person who needed to disappear from one place and reappear somewhere safer, Kazimierz moved with me, and his presence was itself a form of protection. German soldiers did not want to follow a large wolf into dark trees. It is a very simple form of security, and it worked every single time. But this is not the part of the story I need to tell you. This is preparation. What I need to tell you is about the 15th of February, 1945. By February 1945, the German retreat had become a rout. Soviet forces were advancing rapidly, and the remaining German units in our region were moving west in a state of controlled panic. A column of SS troops, perhaps 80 men, came through the forest road that passed 2 kilometers east of Sokolniki on the 14th of February. They set up a temporary camp in the forest, and their commander sent a patrol into the village that evening to requisition food and to make clear that any resistance would result in consequences the village would not recover from. The patrol took everything they could carry and left, but one of the young men in the village, a boy of 17 named Piotr, whose older brother had been killed in the January 1943 massacre, followed the patrol back toward the camp. I do not know what he intended. I do not think he knew either. He was 17 and furious, and grief is not a state that produces careful plans. He was caught at the edge of the forest by 2 SS soldiers and brought to the camp, and we did not know any of this until past midnight when his mother came to the convent door in her nightclothes, barely able to form words. I dressed in less than 2 minutes. I did not think about what I was doing in any way that involved deliberation or strategy. My body simply moved because the alternative was stillness, and I had learned across 2 years of occupation that stillness at the wrong moment is another word for abandonment. Kazimierz was already at the convent gate when I came through it, because he knew my movement in the dark the way he knew everything about me, completely and without needing to be told. We went into the forest together, and I want you to understand what that meant. Moving through those trees in the February dark with a wolf beside me, his shoulder occasionally brushing my leg, his breath visible in the cold air, both of us entirely silent. I was not afraid. This is the thing I have turned over most often in the years since, the fact that I was not afraid, and I have decided that the explanation is simple. I had been preparing for this specific walk for 2 years without knowing it. Every night in the forest, every hour of learning to trust the dark and the animal beside me. I was not brave in that moment. I was simply ready. I found the camp by following Kazimierz, who found it by following scent, and I stood at the tree line looking at the fire and the soldiers and the tent where I believed Piotr was being held. And I made the calculation that I was a 50-year-old nun in a religious habit who posed exactly 0 visible threat to 80 armed men, and that this was my most valuable asset. I walked out of the trees into the firelight with my hands clearly visible and my face composed into the expression I had spent 22 years perfecting, the expression of a woman who is so utterly certain of her place in God's order that no earthly authority can produce even a tremor of doubt in her. A soldier raised his rifle. I kept walking. Another shouted in German. I kept walking. I said in the German I had learned from our convent's German-speaking sisters, "I am looking for my novice. He is a young man, 17. He became lost in the forest, and I believe your men found him." I said it the way I said morning prayers, steady, certain, offering no gap for argument to enter. The commanding officer came out of the main tent. He was exhausted in the way all of them were exhausted by then, worn to something thin and dangerous. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he looked past me into the tree line and his expression changed. I did not turn around because I already knew what he was seeing. Kazimierz had followed me to the edge of the firelight. He was standing at the boundary between darkness and light, completely still, his pale gold eyes catching the fire, enormous and silent and entirely himself. The officer stared at him. Every soldier who had been moving, loading equipment, tending horses, stopped moving. The forest was absolutely quiet except for the fire. Kazimierz did not growl. He did not advance. He simply stood there and looked at the officer with an attention that contained no aggression and no fear, and was somehow, because of that, more frightening than either would have been. The officer looked back at me. I looked at him. He called to someone inside the tent, and Piotr came out, disheveled and pale but unharmed. The officer told me in German to take the boy and go back to my convent. He said it quietly, without theater, the way a man speaks when he has made a decision and does not wish to examine it too closely. I put my hand on Piotr's shoulder and I walked him back into the trees. Kazimierz fell in beside us and we moved through the forest in silence, and we did not look back. The SS column left the following morning without entering Sokolniki. The village was spared, all 312 people in it. I have never claimed that I saved them. I have always said that Kazimierz did, because it is true, and because the truth of it contains something I think is worth preserving. That the wildness I chose not to tame, the creature I had kept entirely as himself, rather than reshaping him into something more manageable and more comfortable, was exactly what the moment required. That the 2 years of learning to move without fear through dark forests had built something in me that no amount of daylight prayer could have built alone. That God works through the living world as fluently as through any chapel, and that sometimes what looks like an eccentric nun and her wolf is actually preparation wearing a disguise. I know this because I lived it. And Kazimierz, who died in the summer of 1948 at the edge of the convent garden with his great gray head resting on my foot, knew it too.